Every night at exactly 10:45 p.m., the same bus driver waited until I reached my stop. I thought it was just part of his job. I had no idea that a stranger behind the wheel would become the person who quietly changed my entire life. My name is Ethan Parker, and before Ryan Mitchell entered my daily routine, my life was something I simply moved through. I was not unhappy, but I was not really looking forward to anything either. I worked long hours, came home to a quiet apartment, and followed the same schedule almost every day. Wake up, go to work, finish my shift, take the last bus home, and repeat. It was predictable, and I told myself that predictable was enough. I had become used to keeping things to myself. I was the kind of person who would say I was fine even when I was exhausted. I did not want to bother anyone with my problems, and I had convinced myself that needing support was something I could avoid. Then one Monday night, everything changed in the smallest way. The usual bus driver I had seen for months was gone, and a new face was sitting behind the wheel. His name was Ryan Mitchell. He greeted every passenger politely, but there was something different about the way he interacted with people. He did not just drive the route and look ahead. He noticed things. He remembered faces. He treated everyone like they were more than just another person getting on the bus. At first, I did not think much of it. To me, he was simply the new driver on my regular route. Someone I would probably forget after a few weeks. But then something happened. The next night, when I stepped onto the bus, Ryan looked up and smiled. He remembered me. He said, "Back again." It was a simple sentence, nothing special, but it caught me off guard. Most people pass through my life without remembering small details about me. I was used to being invisible, but Ryan noticed. Over the next few nights, a small routine began forming. He would greet me when I entered. He would ask how my day was. Sometimes we would talk for a few minutes before I reached my stop. The conversations were never dramatic. They were about ordinary things. The weather, work, music, or something interesting that happened during the day. But somehow, those small conversations became the part of my evening I started looking forward to. I never told him that. I never admitted that the last bus ride home felt different because someone was actually paying attention. I simply sat in my usual seat and enjoyed the quiet comfort of knowing there was someone who recognized me. After a few weeks, I began noticing something strange. Ryan always seemed to make sure I was ready before reaching my stop. He would slow down the conversation when my destination was coming up. He would say goodnight in a way that made the end of my day feel a little less empty. It was nothing obvious, nothing that would make someone else notice. But I noticed, and I started wondering why. Why did this new bus driver seem to care about a passenger he barely knew? Why did he remember me when so many people never did? I did not have the answers yet. I only knew one thing. The person I thought would be just another stranger was slowly becoming the most familiar part of my nightly journey. After a few weeks of taking the same bus home every night, I started realizing that my routine had quietly changed. I still worked the same hours, lived in the same apartment, and followed the same schedule, but there was one difference I could not ignore. I no longer felt like I was simply getting through the day. I had started looking forward to those small conversations with Ryan Mitchell. It was strange because nothing about them seemed extraordinary. We were not having deep conversations every night. We were not talking about life-changing topics. Most of the time, we talked about simple things. But somehow, those simple moments made my evenings feel different. Ryan had a way of making a normal day feel a little less ordinary. I started noticing small details about him too. He always greeted every passenger with the same patience, even after a long shift. He remembered familiar faces and treated people with genuine kindness. It made me realize that his personality was not something he only showed me. Ryan was simply the type of person who made others feel seen. One night, I got on the bus later than usual after a particularly exhausting day at work. I sat down in my usual seat and kept to myself. Normally, I would have spent the entire ride looking out the window and thinking about everything I had to do the next day. But after a few minutes, Ryan asked if my day had been okay. It was a simple question, but for some reason, it caught me by surprise. I told him I was fine because that was always my first answer. Ryan smiled and said something I did not expect. He said that sometimes people say they are fine because they do not want to explain what is really going on. I looked up because it felt like he understood something I had never said out loud. I asked him how he knew that. He simply said that he paid attention. That answer stayed with me for the rest of the ride. Most people waited for someone to directly ask for help before offering support. Ryan seemed to notice things before anyone had to explain them. Over time, I started opening up a little more. Not because Ryan pressured me, but because he created a space where I felt comfortable being honest. I told him small things about my week. I mentioned projects at work, places I wanted to visit someday, and little frustrations that I usually kept to myself. Ryan listened without trying to fix everything. Sometimes he just listened, and I realized how rare that was. I had spent so much time believing that handling everything alone was a sign of strength. But those short conversations on the bus were teaching me something different. Maybe strength was not about never needing anyone. Maybe it was about allowing yourself to accept kindness when someone offered it. One evening, as I stepped off the bus, Ryan called my name before I walked away. I turned around, surprised that he remembered it. He told me to have a good night and said he would see me tomorrow. It was such a small moment, but it made me smile the entire walk home. That was when I realized something had changed. Ryan was no longer just the new bus driver on my route. He had become someone I expected to see. Someone whose kindness had slowly become part of my everyday life. And the more I thought about it, the more curious I became. Because Ryan was doing more than just driving me home every night. He was noticing me. And I still did not understand why. The more I rode that bus home every night, the more I started noticing things I had never paid attention to before. Ryan Mitchell was still the same person behind the wheel. He still greeted passengers, followed the same route, and made sure everyone reached their destination. But somewhere along the way, he stopped feeling like a stranger. He had become someone I looked forward to seeing at the end of each day. I began realizing that the smallest moments were often the ones that stayed with me the longest. A simple question about my day. A quick conversation before my stop. A reminder that someone was paying attention. Those things might not have seemed important to someone else, but to me, they meant more than I expected. For a long time, I had believed that nobody really noticed when I was struggling. I was good at keeping my thoughts to myself and making everything appear normal. But Ryan had a way of noticing the things I tried to hide. One evening, I stepped onto the bus and immediately knew Ryan could tell something was different. I had spent most of the day dealing with stressful situations at work, and by the time I sat down, I did not have the energy to pretend I was completely fine. Ryan did not ask a dozen questions. He did not pressure me to explain. He simply said, "Long day." I laughed quietly because somehow he already knew. I told him that work had been overwhelming, and instead of giving advice, he just listened. That moment stayed with me because I realized how rare it was to have someone who could simply be present. Most people wanted to solve problems. Ryan understood that sometimes people just needed someone to hear them. As the weeks continued, our conversations became more natural. I learned small things about Ryan too. He had always enjoyed helping people. He believed that small acts of kindness could completely change someone's day. When I asked him where that belief came from, he smiled and said that everyone was carrying something others could not see. That answer made me think about my own life. How many times had someone around me needed kindness, but nobody noticed? How many times had I needed someone to notice me? Ryan never acted like he was doing something special. To him, remembering a name or asking how someone was doing seemed normal. But to me, it was becoming something meaningful. One night, as the bus moved through the quiet streets, Ryan asked me if I had always lived in the city. I told him about how I moved there years ago and how I had slowly built a life around work and routines. He asked if I ever felt like something was missing. The question surprised me because I had never really asked myself that. I told him I did not know. For years, I thought having a stable job and a comfortable place to live meant I had everything I needed. But recently, I had started realizing that maybe life was not only about having things. Maybe it was also about having people who made ordinary moments feel important. When I reached my stop that night, I thanked Ryan before leaving. It was a simple thank you, but I meant it more than ever. As I walked home, I found myself wondering about him. Why did he pay so much attention to one passenger among so many? Why did he seem to understand things I never said? I still did not know the answer, but I knew one thing for certain. The new bus driver was no longer just part of my commute. Somehow, without me noticing, he had become part of my life. By the time I reached the 4th week of taking the last bus home, I started realizing that my evenings had changed in a way I never expected. The ride that used to be just a quiet trip between work and my apartment had become something I actually looked forward to. It was not because of the bus itself or the route through the city streets. It was because of the person sitting behind the wheel who somehow made an ordinary journey feel meaningful. Ryan Mitchell never tried to make himself the center of attention. That was one of the things I respected most about him. He did not need people to notice his kindness. He simply offered it naturally, as if making someone feel valued was the most normal thing in the world. One night, I arrived at the bus stop a few minutes later than usual. I expected the bus to already be gone, but when I reached the corner, I saw Ryan waiting at the stop. I stepped on and apologized for being late. He smiled and said it was no problem. Then he added that he remembered I usually arrived around that time. I laughed and told him I did not realize he paid attention to schedules that closely. Ryan shrugged and said he noticed things because it helped him understand people better. That answer stayed in my mind. He made it sound simple, but I knew not everyone looked at the world that way. During the ride, we talked about different things. I mentioned a book I had been trying to finish, and Ryan told me about one he had enjoyed recently. We talked about places we wanted to visit someday and small goals we had never shared with many people. It felt less like a conversation between a passenger and a driver and more like two people slowly getting to know each other. Still, there was something about Ryan that I did not understand. He seemed to know when I needed encouragement. He seemed to know when I wanted to talk and when I just wanted a peaceful ride home. It was as if he had learned a version of me that I had never shown anyone else. One evening, I finally asked him why he was always so observant. I told him that most people went through their day without noticing much about strangers. Ryan smiled and said that everyone had a story, even the people who looked like they had everything together. He explained that a simple conversation could sometimes mean more than people realized. I asked if someone had ever done that for him. His expression changed slightly, and for a moment he became quiet. He said that there was a time in his life when a small act of kindness from another person helped him through a difficult period. He never forgot how much that moment meant to him. That was why he tried to offer the same feeling to others whenever he could. Hearing that made me understand him differently. Ryan was not simply a naturally friendly person. His kindness came from somewhere deeper, came from knowing what it felt like to need someone to notice. After that conversation, I started seeing our nightly rides differently. I stopped thinking of Ryan as someone who was simply being polite. I realized he was someone who had chosen to make a difference in small ways. But there was still something I did not know. Why had he noticed me so quickly? Why did our conversations seem to matter so much to him? I felt like there was a missing piece to the story, and I knew that sooner or later, I would discover the reason behind the kindness of the person who had quietly become the best part of my journey home. After that conversation with Ryan Mitchell, I started thinking about kindness in a completely different way. Before meeting him, I believed that people usually helped each other because of a specific reason. Maybe they needed something in return, maybe it was simply part of their responsibility, or maybe it was just a polite gesture that did not mean much. But Ryan showed me that sometimes people do kind things because they genuinely care. They do not need recognition. They do not need a reward. They simply choose to make someone else's day a little better. As the days passed, my conversations with Ryan became a normal part of my life. I found myself looking forward to the last bus ride more than I wanted to admit. It became the moment when I could finally relax after a long day. I would sit in my usual seat, watch the city lights pass by the windows, and talk with someone who made me feel like I was not just another person passing through. One evening, Ryan noticed that I seemed quieter than usual. I told him I was just tired, but he asked if something had been on my mind. For a moment, I almost gave the usual answer. I almost said I was fine and changed the subject. But something about talking to Ryan made honesty feel easier. I told him that I had been feeling like my life had become too repetitive. I was grateful for what I had, but sometimes I wondered if I was simply moving through each day without really enjoying it. Ryan listened carefully and then said something I never forgot. He told me that sometimes people become so focused on reaching the next stage of life that they forget to appreciate the moments happening right now. His words made me think because I realized I had been doing exactly that. I had been waiting for something big to change instead of noticing the small things that were already making my life better. Our conversation continued, and for the first time, I learned more about Ryan's own story. He told me that becoming a bus driver was not something he had originally planned. Earlier in his life, he had imagined following a completely different path. But after experiencing certain changes and meeting people who helped him during important moments, he realized he wanted a career where he could interact with others every day. He wanted to be someone who could bring a little positivity into people's routines. I asked him if he always knew how much his small actions affected people. Ryan smiled and said he did not. He said most people probably never noticed, and that was okay. For him, kindness was not about knowing the result. It was about making the effort. That answer surprised me because I realized Ryan had no idea how much his presence had changed my own routine. He had become someone I trusted, someone I felt comfortable talking to, someone who reminded me that I was not as alone as I thought I was. When I reached my stop that night, I thanked him before leaving. But this time, my thank you carried a different meaning. It was not just appreciation for a pleasant conversation. It was gratitude for the way he had slowly become part of my life. As I walked home, I found myself wondering about something I had never considered before. Ryan had told me why he cared about helping people, but I still did not know why he seemed to notice me so much. There was still a piece of the story waiting to be discovered, and I had a feeling that the answer would change the way I saw every night we had shared on that bus. The more time I spent talking with Ryan Mitchell, the more I realized that our nightly bus rides had become something much bigger than a simple routine. What started as a few friendly conversations between a passenger and a driver had slowly turned into a connection I never expected. Ryan had become someone who understood me in a way that very few people ever had. He noticed when I was quiet. He remembered the small details I shared. He made ordinary moments feel important without ever trying to make them seem special. But there was still one question I could not stop thinking about. Why me? Ryan treated everyone with kindness, but there was something different about the way he noticed me. It felt like he understood parts of my life that I had never explained. One evening, I decided to ask him directly. The bus was almost empty, and the city streets were quieter than usual. I sat in my usual seat while Ryan continued driving the familiar route we both knew so well. After a few minutes of conversation, I finally asked him why he always remembered me. I asked if there was a reason he paid such close attention to one passenger out of all the people who rode his bus. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked thoughtful, almost like he had been expecting that question eventually. Then he smiled and told me that the reason was actually simple. He said that when he first started driving that route, he noticed how I always sat alone and looked like I was carrying a lot on my mind. He said he did not know my story, but he recognized the feeling of someone trying to handle everything without letting anyone see it. His answer surprised me because I realized he had noticed something I had spent years trying to hide. Ryan told me that he did not want to interrupt my life or make assumptions about what I was going through. He just wanted me to know that someone noticed. Someone cared. Someone was there. Hearing those words made me think about all the times I had felt invisible. I had never expected a person I met on a bus route to understand me so quickly. I had spent so much time believing that nobody could see beyond the version of myself I showed the world. But Ryan had seen something deeper. He had noticed the quiet moments, the tired expressions, and the small signs that I needed someone to remind me that I mattered. I asked Ryan if there was a reason he understood that feeling so well. He nodded and told me that there had been a time in his life when he felt the same way. He explained that someone had once shown him unexpected kindness during a difficult period, and that simple act stayed with him. It reminded him that people often need support before they know how to ask for it. That was why he tried to offer the same kindness whenever he could. After that conversation, everything felt different. I no longer saw Ryan as just the person who drove me home every night. I saw him as someone who had chosen to make a small difference in my life without expecting anything in return. But what surprised me most was realizing that Ryan had changed my perspective without even trying. He had reminded me that people can enter your life in unexpected ways and leave an impact you never saw coming. And as I stepped off the bus that night, I knew there was still more to learn about the person who had quietly become such an important part of my journey. After learning why Ryan Mitchell paid such close attention to me, I started seeing our nightly bus rides in a completely new way. For weeks, I had wondered why a person I barely knew seemed to notice things that even people who had known me for years sometimes missed. Now I finally understood. Ryan was not trying to change my life. He was simply offering the same kindness that someone once gave him. But somehow, that simple choice had created a connection neither of us expected. The days that followed felt different. I found myself becoming more open, not just with Ryan, but with other people around me too. Before meeting him, I had built a habit of keeping everything inside. I thought sharing my struggles would make me seem less capable. I thought needing support meant I was not handling life correctly. But Ryan helped me realize that everyone needs someone who listens. Everyone needs moments where they can stop pretending everything is perfect. One evening, I got on the bus and noticed Ryan looked more thoughtful than usual. Normally, he was the one asking how my day was, but that night I asked about his. He smiled and said he was surprised I noticed. I laughed and told him that he was not the only one paying attention. That small moment showed me how much our friendship had changed. At the beginning, Ryan was the person who noticed me. Now I was starting to notice him too. During that ride, Ryan shared more about his own life. He told me that becoming a bus driver had taught him something important. He said that every person who stepped onto his bus was carrying a story he could not see. Some people were excited about their day. Some people were tired. Some people were quietly hoping for a better tomorrow. He said that was why he believed small moments mattered. A friendly conversation or a simple greeting could sometimes stay with someone longer than you realized. Listening to him, I understood why Ryan was different. His kindness was not something he performed. It was something that had become part of who he was. He had experienced what it felt like when someone showed up at the right moment, and he wanted to give that feeling to others. I told him that I hoped he knew how much those small moments meant to me. I told him that before he came into my life, I never realized how much I needed a simple conversation at the end of the day. Ryan smiled and said he was glad he could be there. But he also reminded me that I had changed too. He said that when he first met me, I seemed like someone who was trying to carry everything alone. Now, he saw someone who was beginning to let people in. That stayed with me because I realized he was right. Ryan had not just become someone who made my evenings better. He had helped me become a different version of myself. As the bus continued through the familiar streets, I looked out the window and thought about how unexpected life could be. I never planned to meet Ryan. I never expected a person I met during a regular commute to become someone so important. But sometimes the people who change us the most do not arrive in dramatic ways. Sometimes they simply appear in our everyday routine and quietly remind us that we are not alone. And for the first time in a long time, I was grateful that someone had noticed me. As the weeks passed, I started realizing that my life had changed in ways I never expected. The biggest difference was not something obvious that other people could see. It was something quieter. I had started paying attention to the moments that made each day meaningful. Before Ryan Mitchell came into my routine, I spent most of my time focused on getting through responsibilities. Work, errands, and daily tasks filled my schedule, and I rarely stopped to appreciate the small things around me. But those nightly bus rides changed my perspective. Ryan showed me that ordinary moments could become important when shared with the right person. One evening, I arrived at the bus stop and noticed Ryan was already there waiting for passengers. When I stepped onto the bus, he greeted me with the same familiar smile he had shown me since the beginning. But this time, something felt different. I realized that I was no longer just someone Ryan remembered from his route. We had become two people who genuinely cared about each other's lives. During the ride, we talked about the future. I told Ryan that I had started making changes in my own life. I was spending more time with people I cared about. I was reaching out instead of always waiting for others to notice me. I was finally allowing myself to be part of the world instead of standing on the outside watching it happen. Ryan seemed happy to hear that. He told me that was the thing he hoped for when he offered kindness to people. He did not want them to depend on him forever. He wanted them to remember that they were valuable and capable of creating meaningful connections. His words made me realize something important. Ryan had never tried to become the center of my life. He had simply reminded me that my life was already worth sharing with others. That was what made his kindness so special. He gave without expecting anything back. He cared without needing recognition. One night, I asked Ryan if he ever thought a simple bus route would lead to such a meaningful friendship. He laughed and said no. He told me that when he first started driving that route, he was only focused on learning the schedule and doing his job well. He never expected one passenger to become someone he would look forward to seeing every night. Hearing that made me smile, because I felt the same way. I never expected the person driving me home after work to become someone who would change the way I viewed connection and kindness. As the bus moved through the city, I thought about how different my life felt compared to a few months earlier. I still had the same apartment. I still worked the same job. I still followed many of the same routines. But I was different. I was more open. I was more willing to accept kindness. I was more aware that everyone around me had a story worth understanding. When I reached my stop, I thanked Ryan like I always did. But this time, the words felt heavier because I knew they carried more meaning. I was not just thanking him for the rides home. I was thanking him for reminding me that small acts of care could create lasting change. As I walked toward my apartment, I realized something I would never forget. Sometimes the people who change our lives do not enter with a grand moment or a dramatic event. Sometimes they simply show up again and again, quietly proving that someone believes we are worth noticing. Months later, I still found myself thinking about the first night Ryan Mitchell drove that bus route. At the time, I had no idea that a simple greeting from a stranger would become the beginning of one of the most meaningful connections in my life. I thought I was just another passenger taking the last ride home after a long day. I never expected someone to notice the things I had spent years hiding. I never expected a person I barely knew to remind me that I was not invisible. Looking back, I realized that Ryan never changed my life through one huge moment. He changed it through hundreds of small ones. Every conversation, every kind question, every reminder that someone cared. He showed me that kindness did not have to be complicated to matter. Sometimes it was simply remembering someone's name. Sometimes it was asking how their day was and truly listening to the answer. Sometimes it was showing up consistently until someone finally believed they were worth showing up for. Ryan eventually changed his schedule, and I knew there would come a time when our nightly bus rides would not be part of my everyday routine anymore. At first, I thought I would miss the conversations the most. But what I realized later was that the most important thing Ryan gave me was not the time we spent talking. It was the lesson I carried with me afterward. He taught me to notice people. He taught me to be more open. He taught me that everyone around us might be carrying something we cannot see. One evening, during one of our final rides together on that route, we talked about how strange it was that two people with completely different lives could meet in such an ordinary place. Ryan smiled and said that life often works that way. The most important people sometimes enter our stories in ways we never plan. I told him that I hoped he knew how much he had helped me. I told him that before meeting him, I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone genuinely interested in my life. Ryan looked surprised and said he felt the same way. He said that getting to know me had reminded him why small acts of kindness mattered. That conversation stayed with me because I realized something important. I thought Ryan was the person who needed to teach me something, but the truth was that we had both changed because of our friendship. He gave me confidence to reconnect with people, and I reminded him that the little things he did every day had real meaning. When I think about that bus route now, I do not remember the exact streets we traveled or the number of times I sat in that same seat. What I remember is the feeling of being noticed. The feeling of knowing that someone cared. The feeling of realizing that life could become brighter because of one unexpected connection. Ryan was once just a new bus driver on my way home. Now, he is the person who reminded me that kindness can find us anywhere. Sometimes the people who change our lives do not arrive when we are searching for them. They appear during ordinary moments, quietly becoming part of our story before we even realize it. And every time I see someone who looks like they might need a little kindness, I remember Ryan. I remember the person who showed up every night and changed my life without ever trying to.